This past year, we grew a big trial of 15 different varieties of onions, all grown from seeds, which is something that I've wanted to do for a while. I decided to replace the usual large crop of onions in the simple garden that we have grown in the past using onion sets, replacing it with multi-sown modules of onion seeds, with enough plants of each variety to hopefully be able to make a decent comparison. Overall, I was really impressed with this crop, as there was a much bigger yield than I had expected from onion plants grown from seed, even though the seedlings were stressed earlier in the year with poor growing conditions. And fewer of the onion plants in this large batch bolted or started to produce seed compared to the two of the other gardens where we grew 3 of these same varieties. And with the good weather that we got this year, there was good yield from all the different varieties and enough variation in the yields to start to figure out which varieties I might want to grow again. A lot of the varieties that we grew were fairly typical types of onions with a globe or round shape and a yellow or straw-colored skin. The first one, a variety called Ailsa Craig, was one of the varieties that we had also grown in the other gardens, where quite a few of the plants of this variety bolted in 2 of the gardens with a more densely spaced plants. With a slightly lower density of plants in this variety trial, only 2 of the 28 plants bolted, and 1 of the bulbs split at the base, but the rest produced a good yield of large bulbs, which were slightly elongated, but I think that was more because the plants were squished together in the multi-sown stations. Looking at one bulb that I cut open, the top of the bulb wasn't so tight, which might indicate an issue with storage, but apart from that, and the possible tendency to bolt, this looks like a decent standard variety that can produce a lot of onions. Another globe-shaped variety called Rinsberger 5 produced decent-sized bulbs, but something seemed to have happened with a lot of the plants, with a few of the clusters missing, and I'm not sure what happened. The inside of one bulb that I cut open had pronounced drying or decay of the leaves at the top of the bulb, which reduced the amount that is edible and may affect how long it will store. But another bulb of the same variety had a tighter top, which is what I want to see. So I won't know how common this is with this variety or with any of the other varieties until we cut open a lot more of the bulbs. The Sturon variety is one of the few varieties that I've grown before from onion sets, and this batch, grown from seeds, produced nice quality bulbs, some of which were slightly flatter in shape, with no apparent issues and looked good on the inside. But they were smaller than the others in this first set of varieties, producing only a moderate yield. Each of these 3 similar open-pollinated varieties seem to have issues, either with bolting, rotting, missing plants, or a smaller yield. But based on this one trial, I'd probably pick the Ailsa Craig variety to grow again, at least for producing large quantities of conventional types of onions. The open-pollinated Rose de Carriel variety looked like a fairly conventional onion on the outside, with a slight rose-colored skin, but this rose coloring continued into the center of the bulb, producing quite an attractive onion. This variety produced a relatively high yield, but unfortunately 3 of the bulbs were rotten at the base, and another had split open from the inside, indicating that it might not be so successful in this climate, especially if we get cool and wet summer weather. But the remaining bulbs ended up being larger than most of the other varieties, weighing over 400 grams each on average, so perhaps it is worth growing again. There was one other variety called Stuttgart Giant that I would generally include in this set of straw-colored onion varieties, with a similar coloring inside that many of the others had. But it had a distinctive flattened shape that differentiates it from the other varieties. The yield of this variety was mediocre, and it had the smallest bulb size out of all of the varieties, but the shape and color was quite attractive, and it didn't seem to have any issues with bolting or rotting. One of the 2 hybrid varieties that we grew in this trial, named High Tech, produced quite a consistent crop of well-shaped, fairly large onions, and the 3rd highest yield of all the varieties. None of the plants showed any signs of bolting, but there was one small plant that rotted in the garden, so I'm not sure if this is significant. The other hybrid variety, called Santero, was one of 3 varieties that I grew in the other gardens, where quite a few of the plants had bolted, but none of this trial started to produce the flower stalk prematurely. One bulb started to rot before it dried, but the rest of the bulbs seemed decent quality, but the bulb size and yield was significantly smaller than the other hybrid type, and seemed less consistent. Based on this one trial and a relatively small sample size, I'm not sure if it's worth the extra cost of the Santero hybrid seeds, but I think it might be worth growing the high-tech variety again. Two of the varieties produced bulbs that were definitely quite a bit bigger than the others, and both had paler yellow skin. The Bedfordshire Champion variety produced some of the largest bulbs, weighing 540 grams each on average, with some of them quite a bit larger, though this was partially because some of the seedlings in a few clusters did not survive the start of the season. And a few of the larger bulbs ended up splitting open at the base, more than with many of the other varieties. And this reduced the usable yield that we harvested, but the inside of the onion that I cut open seemed in good shape, though fairly typical. The Globo variety produced the biggest yield of this trial, of consistently large bulbs that didn't seem to have any issues, and inside there was a pronounced red banding which really accentuated the different layers. The plants were still growing strong when they were harvested in September, with no signs of the usual lodging that occurs with many of the other varieties when they stop growing. So this crop might have grown even bigger, and if I wanted the largest yield of big onions, this Globo variety is definitely one to grow. Though apparently it is not great for long-term storage. We grew 3 red onion varieties as part of this trial, each producing beautiful globe-shaped onions with a deep red or purple skin and a similar purple coloring inside, though they didn't produce as well as most of the straw-colored varieties. The Carmen variety had a slightly larger yield of slightly bigger bulbs than the other 2 varieties, but a few of the onions rotted before they dried, and one was split at the base. We had also grown this variety in the other gardens, and with a similar lower yields compared to the more typical colored varieties. And a few of the bulbs split at the base with this variety as well in the other gardens. The Red Baron variety had a smaller bulb size and the smallest yield of the 3, but only marginally, and a few of these onions ended up splitting at the base, and I wonder if this is a more common among red onion varieties. The Robelia variety was similar size and yield to the Red Baron variety, but didn't have any of the roots splitting, but the top or neck of the bulb was quite wide, though with a small sample size like this it's hard to tell if this is a characteristic of the variety. There is not much difference between these 3 varieties in terms of yield, but the Red Baron variety seemed to produce bulbs that were tightly wrapped, with a thinner closed neck or top, which might indicate that they will store better. 3 of the onion varieties that we grew developed much more elongated bulbs, which I've not seen before. The Cipolla di Tropea variety produced bulbs that look stretched, with a range of shapes from more bulb-like to more elongated, but they were quite large and had a beautiful dark pink colored skin that continued into the inside of the bulb. The one bulb that I cut open seemed separated into several distinct sections, which is interesting, though I'm not sure how common it is to the variety or if this affects how it can be used in the kitchen or how long it will store. This planting of this variety included a large Globo onion that had obviously grown from a misplaced seed, and even without this one large plant, the yield was quite good, but it could have been even higher. The Langue de Florence Semaine variety had quite similar elongated bottle-shaped bulbs, with a very similar color and similar coloring inside the bulb, though with more layers. This variety had a similar yield and bulb size to the other elongated variety, but quite a few of the bulbs still had green shoots, either as regrowth or leaves that had not dried off yet, which were covered with a black fly or aphid. This could be cut off for storage, but it seems that the bulbs of this variety were not going into the dormant stage that was common with all the other onions in the trial, indicating that they would not store for very long. The Tosca variety had a similar elongated shape, though more cylindrical than the other 2, and the straw-colored skin and internal coloring similar to many of the typical straw-colored varieties. These onions were quite a bit smaller than any of the other varieties in the trial, producing the smallest yield, less than half the weight of some of the more productive varieties. Looking at the yields of all the different varieties, as they are laid out along the length of the bed, there is a definite slope, with the plants at one end of the bed seeming to produce a higher yield than the plants on the other end. This could be just a coincidence with the arrangement of the varieties in the bed, especially with 2 of the larger producing varieties at one end of the bed. But it could also be due to changing soil quality or fertility along the length of the bed, with the larger yielding varieties towards one end of the bed having better growing conditions. But the total harvest from this large bed in the Simple Garden, including the less productive varieties, is significantly better than in the previous 5 seasons that have grown a big batch of onions as part of the crop rotation of this garden. An overall yield of almost 9.5 kilograms per square meter is significantly better than any other year, and a lot of this increase could be due to relatively good growing conditions that we had this past year, especially compared to a few crops a couple of years ago that had really reduced yields due to serious issues with mildew. But the gradual increase since then could be because of improving soil health and fertility in this garden, and the use of better disease-resistant varieties. But until this year, I had only grown a single variety each season from onion sets that I had bought in. I used to only grow onions from sets, partially because I felt that they were easier, and I'd also been put off using seeds by the not great crops the local community farm was getting when growing from seed. This season was the first time I grew a large onion crop from seeds, and I have been pleasantly surprised with the results, even with all the different varieties. It was great to be able to get a good growing season for this first trial of onion varieties. And if I had to select varieties from this one trial, I'd probably pick the open-pollinated Ailsa Craig and possibly the high-tech hybrid variety for growing a typical onion storage crop, and growing both of them might make a good hedge against possible bolting issues. It would be fun to grow the Globo variety for very large bulbs for use in the autumn, and I quite like the color and decent yield of the Rose de Kerouac variety. The Red Baron seems to be a decent option for a red onion, and the Chipotle de Tropea seems to be a really interesting and beautiful onion. But I realize that variety trials like this should generally be repeated over a couple of seasons, as different varieties respond to changing weather patterns in different ways and can have different levels of disease resistance. So I am planning another similar trial for the same garden next year, and I've already sown another batch of seeds for an overwintering trial in one of the polytunnels, and I'm interested in harvesting them as fresh, immature plants, as apparently some of the varieties are typically grown for this rather than for storage onions. I don't have a lot of experience growing onions for harvesting at different times of the year and at different stages, and no doubt I would end up selecting different varieties for different uses. I still need to figure out which of these varieties will store better than the others, as this is a really important factor for ensuring that we have access to homegrown onions all year round. And I plan to keep a few onions of each variety over the winter and into the spring, essentially waiting until each variety degrades, sprouts, or rots. And of course, another key factor that I have not yet explored is the taste of all these onions and how well they cook, and which ones are better for different uses in the kitchen. But I still don't know how to do an effective taste test with so many varieties of onions, especially if I want to cook them in several different ways. This will be a time-consuming, though probably enjoyable task, but I'm not sure I'm looking forward to sampling raw onions from 15 different varieties.